So we're going to describe the brain and spinal cord, but before we do that, we'll do an introduction to the nervous system. So make sure you look at your key concepts and you must know everything in those key concepts, okay? So the first is, what are the functions of the nervous system? So it is a controlling system. It kind of receives impulses, it sends impulses out, and then whatever impulse it receives, it actually integrates that information, it processes that information, and then decides what information I must send out, okay? So that's why we call it a master controlling and an integration system. So here is where it's important to know certain key concepts. First is what is called a sensory input. The brain receives information. The information it receives is known as sensory input. So this is information that the brain and spinal cord, or what is actually called the central nervous system, so we'll say the central nervous system receives sensory input. What is sensory input? Sensory input, think of the word sensory, has to do with sensation. So sensory input means it receives input with regard to sensations in your body. Sensations are, for example, like, being touched, pinched, have a hot object placed on you, feeling warmth or cold, temperature, right? Or even vibration sense, if I put a tuning fork somewhere, you can feel that. So these are what are called general sensations. And then there are special sensations. For example, can anyone think of a special sensation? Taste, exactly. Taste is a special sensation. Anything else? Smell, yes. Those are, again, special sensations. So taste, smell. Keeping in line with this, anything else? Hearing, vision, yes. So hearing, vision, taste, smell, even equilibrium, the balance, that's a sensation. All these are what are called special sensations. And then we have general sensations, which were, those of touch, temperature, pain, okay? And even sensation of the tenseness in your muscle, like is your muscle fully contracted, is your muscle relaxed, that kind of a sensation. So this is sensation which comes from muscles and joints too. For example, do you know if your joint is flexed? Do you know if your joint is extended? That kind of a sensation which comes from muscle and joints is known as proprioception. And it's there further down in a slide, so you don't really need to write it. It's called proprioception, okay? So this is sensory input, and this input goes to the brain. So this is carrying sensations, and you can see it is going towards. And if you look up here, you can see they're showing you this person's looking at a glass of water and it's going to the brain, okay? The brain processes that information. So that is integration in the brain, the processing of the information it receives. So that is what is called integration. And if needed, if you need to react to it, that is what is known as the motor output. So imagine when you look at something, when you have a sensation, someone just pinching your hand, you may not react to it, but say somebody really pinches hard and you say, ouch, and you take your hand away. So what have you done? You have reacted to it. So think of that reaction. What is that reaction brought about by contraction of your muscles which move that part away, right? And muscles are motor, right? Remember there was that neuromuscular motor end plate. Do you remember that? So anything to do with muscle or glands is motor. So that kind of output, which is think of an output as a reaction, which is brought about by either muscle or glands. And why I'm mentioning glands is, for example, you smelled something really nice. So that's a sensation, and you begin to salivate. So that's your gland secreting. So that's a reaction to that smell, okay? So motor output is like a reaction brought about by muscles and glands. And here you can see the output is when the nervous system, when this central nervous system here is sending the information to the muscle and causing you to perform an action. So sensory information goes to the brain and spinal cord. Motor information goes from the brain and spinal cord to the muscles. Okay, so it's going out. So sensory information, we will say, goes into the nervous system. Motor information comes out of the nervous system. Okay, so this is really important for you to understand. Sensory is just sensation, and so that's why we use the word sensory with it. Motor is muscle contraction or glandular secretion, and remember, motor end plate had to do with muscle. Okay, so these are two terms which you must really understand. So now I've been talking about, I kind of threw in central nervous system, and I mentioned that part. So let's look at how we divide the nervous system anatomically. And here you're going to use everything from the first lecture which you had, where you had something called dorsal, in your introduction, dorsal body cavity and ventral body cavity. Then when you did the skeletal system, if you remember, we talked of intervertebral foramina through which spinal nerves came out. And then we talked in the muscular system, we talked about how a nerve supplies a muscle, right? We're kind of going to put all this together. So here, if you look at the anatomical division of the nervous system, right in the dorsal body cavity, in the central axis of the body. So right here in your skull and your vertebral column, which is the dorsal body cavity, is the brain and the spinal cord. So since they are right in the middle, central axis of your body, the midline of the body, they form part of what is known as the central nervous system. So you see this here, they form part of the central nervous system. Attached to the brain and the spinal cord are nerves which come out from the brain, and then there are nerves which come out from the spinal cord as well. These which come out from the brain, because the brain is in the skull or cranium, these are known as cranial nerves, the nerves which are attached to the brain, and the nerves which are attached to the spinal cord are known as spinal nerves. And what these are doing is they are going towards the periphery. So these nerves connect the brain to the rest of your body. And if you look, if I was to draw the face up here, and then the rest of the body here. So the cranial nerves will go to the face, and the spinal nerves will go from the neck downwards to all of the body. So that's how they connect the central nervous system to the body, right? So they go all the way right like this. So these nerves, these are the ones which pass out between, if you remember when we had two vertebrae, so if I'm looking at a vertebra from the side, and so that's one vertebra there, and this is the other one here. And from the side, you remember we had a little foramen present here, which was known as the intervertebral foramen. And through this is where those spinal nerves came out. And in the skull, you remember you had tiny little foramina present. One foramen, your optic canal. You remember that? Optic canal in the skull, you should remember that. There was a little canal through which passed the optic nerve. And where the optic nerve went to the eye, because anything to do with the eye has either the word ophthalmic or optic or something like that. So it came out from the brain and through the optic canal and went to the eye, right? So that's how it gets out. The cranial nerves get out through foramina in the skull. The spinal nerves get out through the intervertebral foramina between vertebrae, and that's how they reach the periphery. Okay? So these cranial nerves and spinal nerves are what are part of the peripheral nervous system. And the brain and spinal cord are part of what are called the central nervous system. Another way to look at this is, imagine, and I'm just going to use another slide, something like this. And here, imagine you have, and the example I was giving some people was, imagine you have this huge switchboard. I know nowadays we don't have things like switchboard, but for lack of another example. So imagine you have this huge switchboard in a very, very big organization, which has, these these are those little plug points in here, and these are sort of plugs with telephone lines which kind of go in here like this, okay? So this switchboard is kind of the hub where all the activity and the processing takes place. So think of this switchboard as the central nervous system. So it is located just there. And here, can you see these sort of little cables which are bringing calls in or taking calls out? These are your cranial and spinal nerves. So these are part of the peripheral nervous system, okay? So much like how a cable, a telephone cable, like, you know, when you're at home, when you have a landline and it has a cable, you can get calls which come to you, or you can make calls. Similarly, in a switchboard, you can have calls which come to the switchboard. That means these are impulses which are coming towards the central nervous system. So we will call this sensory, right? Remember, sensory was going towards the central nervous system. And then the central nervous system sent impulses out of it, which were known as motor output, remember? So in other words, this cable or this nerve is capable of carrying impulses. It's capable of carrying sensory impulses, and it's also capable of carrying motor impulses, and they travel in opposite directions, okay? It's like a highway. How, imagine you have cars going north and you have cars going south, right? Both traveling on the same highway, but just in different directions. Got that? So those are like nerves, and the central hub is this switchboard, which I call, this is the central nervous system, okay? So based on this, if we go back to this previous slide here, so this peripheral nervous system, which are those cables which I was talking about, or those spinal and cranial nerves, they have sensory fibers and they have motor fibers. And now let's kind of introduce some more terms. Sensory fibers are also called afferent fibers. We already said sensory means it carries impulses to the central nervous system. The word afferent is also used for anything which goes towards a particular object or an organ. So sensory, since it's going towards the central nervous system, we also call it afferent. Motor, we defined as something where it goes from the central nervous system to the outside, which was to muscles and glands. So anything which goes out is also from an organ, it goes out. It's also, the word we also use is efferent. So in the nervous system, quite often the word sensory and afferent become synonymous, and the word motor and efferent become synonymous. Okay? Got that? Sensory, as we said, is carrying impulses to the central nervous system. So I gave you an example, whether the sensation was from skin, for example, the skin, the general sensation of touch, temperature, pain, pressure, all of that. I also gave you an example where you can feel your skeletal muscle or joints. So here we can also use the word joints. Skeletal muscle and joints, where you can see the position of, where you can feel the position of joints. You don't really have to look to know whether your joint is flexed or extended. Or, for example, as I said, you can actually feel the tension in your muscles. Is your muscle contracted? Is your muscle relaxed? It is really tense, that. So this kind of information from skeletal muscle and joints is known as proprioception. So any information which comes from the skin, from skeletal muscle, and body wall is all of this periphery, all of this area. And here I might also want to add the special sensations, remember, which we just talked about, which was sight, smell, taste, and so on. So the impulses are carried from these regions to the central nervous system. So these, since they go from the skin or the body wall, we call them somatic impulses. Somatic is because it is developed from little pieces of tissue in the fetus, which were called somites, and they make up your skin and your your entire body wall. So that's why it's called somatic, okay? So this, you all know, we just talked about it. So what we were talking about when I said if I pinch you, or if I put a hot object on you, or if you see something, all of this, so we'll call this as somatic. The sight and so on, we kind of just put them a little bit separately, calling them special sensations. Now, you also may have heard that, so-and-so suffered from a heart attack, right? And when they suffer from a heart attack, they complained of severe pain in the chest. So that was a pain from an organ. The word we use for an organ is also known as a viscous. The word viscous is the synonym for an organ. So pain can also arise not necessarily only from skin and muscle, but it can also come from an organ. I mean, hopefully none of you will ever have a heart attack, but you've heard of people who have. But at some point in your life, you've all felt pain in your stomach, right? You all say, I have a stomach ache. Like you've had gas in your stomach, you've had pain, of little babies who have colic. Sometimes when your bladder is really full and you're dying to go, but then, the place and the time is not appropriate, you feel, you kind of feel so uncomfortable and really, it causes a lot of pain. So that kind of a pain which comes either from the bladder or any such organ, or say from the small intestine or large intestine, which is full of gas, which is causing colic, or for example, when you have a severe stomach ache and you've got an upset stomach and you have to throw up in order to feel better, again, that's because of stretch. Or someone who suffers from a heart attack and complains of pain behind the chest. So that is the information which is coming from an organ. Now, organs do not feel pain like your skin. In other words, if you put a hot object on an organ, or if you put a cold object on an organ, or you pinched an organ, you will not feel pain. Organs feel pain only if they are stretched. And think of it, babies have colic when their intestines are full of gas, and that's why they cry, and that's why we always say you need to burp them so that, they take out the air and the intestines don't get stretched. Or in case of a heart attack, what happens is that the blood vessels which supply the muscle of the heart, those blood vessels have got a blockage. So the heart muscle is not getting any blood supply, and that lack of blood supply is known as ischemia. The word ischemia is lack of blood supply, which means there's lack of oxygen, because after all, why do you need blood to an organ? So that you get oxygen, right? So organs feel pain in these two ways. Either they are stretched or they may lack a blood supply. So if any of these things happen to an organ, the impulses will go from that organ. So I'm just saying, let's say you have a stomach which you've eaten too much and you're feeling so uncomfortable and painful. That's because now your stomach has stretched this much. So from the walls of the stomach, the impulses will travel by means of nerves, and then they will enter into the spinal cord and go all the way up to the brain. So this is, you can see, going towards the central nervous system. So this is also a sensory impulse, but since it's coming from the viscera, we call it visceral impulse, okay? So we can see that sensory impulses can be of two types. Either they come from the skin and the body wall, where we call it somatic, or they come from an organ, in which case we call it visceral. Then these cranial and spinal nerves, they also, remember I said they were like a two-way street. They were like those cables which were getting incoming calls and outgoing calls. So this was the incoming call, then we had the outgoing calls. So we have the cable also has motor impulses which pass out, which was this. See, the motor impulse which is passing out, that is also called efferent. It carries impulses from the central nervous system to muscles and glands. Now, if it's going to the skeletal muscle, we will call it somatic. We'll call those somatic motor. If it is going to smooth and cardiac muscle and glands, we will call it autonomic. You remember when we were doing the muscular system, I said skeletal muscle is supplied by the somatic nervous system. And I told you that cardiac and smooth muscles are supplied by the autonomic nervous system. See? So that's where we are bringing this back here. So here, if we look here, so these peripheral nerves, the cranial and these are spinal. So I'm just taking one example. In a spinal nerve, it will carry impulses to the central nervous system this way, and this is coming from the skin. So let's say the skin of the hand, it's going towards the central nervous system. So this is this sensory somatic impulse. And it will also, the same spinal nerve will also carry impulses going to, say, your flexor muscles of the forearm. So these are motor impulses. Since they are going to skeletal muscle, we will say they are motor somatic. Have you followed? Okay, so these nerves are carrying motor and sensory fibers. If the impulse comes from an organ and it's traveling to the central nervous system, we will call it visceral impulse, visceral sensory. If the nerves have to go to an organ and supply either the smooth muscle or the cardiac muscle, then we will call it autonomic visceral, okay, because it'll be going to a viscous. So those are known as, or we just simply say autonomic. So autonomic motor fibers go to smooth and cardiac muscle and glands, okay. The autonomic nervous system is further divided into two parts. One is called, which we will do in the next unit. They are called, the two parts for now you should know, they are called sympathetic and parasympathetic. They always kind of work hand in hand. One system is depressed and another system kind of acts up. If the body needs to change, then it'll depress the other system and make this other one kind of act up. The sympathetic system is a system which kind of comes into play when you need to be really alert. So it's often called the flight and fight system. The parasympathetic is one where you don't need to, you're at rest, your digestion is going on normally, your glands are acting, your heart rate doesn't need to be very high, you don't need to be breathing very rapidly. So the parasympathetic is known as an at-rest system, okay? So here, have you followed that the peripheral nervous system, which consists of cranial and spinal nerves, has fibers which take information to the central nervous system, and it also has fibers which bring information from the central nervous system. So it has both sensory and motor. The peripheral nervous system, the sensory impulses are of two types: somatic, which is coming from the skin or skeletal muscle, or from the organ which is called visceral. And the motor impulses are either it is going to skeletal muscle, or when it's called somatic, or it is going to autonomic, which means it's only going to smooth and cardiac muscle and glands. Like when I say glands, it's like your sweat glands, your lacrimal gland, which makes you cry, your salivary glands, which makes you salivate, or all your digestive glands present in your gastrointestinal tract. Okay, have you followed? So here, if you look at it, can you see the word somatic is present under sensory and under motor, whereas autonomic is only present under motor. Can you see that? So functionally, if we were to divide it, can you see that somatic nervous system, because remember it's going to skeletal muscle, which was a voluntary muscle. We often call the somatic nervous system the voluntary nervous system based on what kind of muscle it supplies. It has a sensory component, which is the afferent component, which is the information taken from skin, muscle, joints. And this is going to the central nervous system. And it has a motor component, which is information from the central nervous system going to skeletal muscle. So can you see that? Autonomic, on the other hand, is known as the involuntary system. It is only motor, and it goes to smooth and cardiac muscle and glands. So there is no sensory component to the autonomic nervous system. Have you understood? Okay? Okay, so let's do a little bit of a review. Which system innervates skeletal muscle? Very good. Somatic nervous system, not sympathetic. Remember, sympathetic is part of autonomic, goes to cardiac, smooth muscle and glands. Okay. Now think of this. You prick your hand on a thorn and feel pain. Now this would be as a result of think, feel. What do you feel? The word feel should give you a hint. Sensory impulse, you feel sensations, right? Look, it's carried to, the word, remember, sensory was being carried to the central nervous system. So this is a sensory impulse. How about this one? You immediately jerk your hand away from the thorn. This would be as a result of, so here you performed an action. There's an output. Very good. A motor impulse being carried from the CNS. That's what made you react and take your hand away. Excellent. So this is a really good slide for review. So, look at this. So, make sure you kind of look at these slides. And one tip I would give you is that take pictures of slides like this on your phone and kind of keep looking at it, whenever you have a break or something, because it's explained really nicely. So if you look at it, everything that I said, central nervous system has brain and spinal cord. This is the one which has the integrative and control centers. The peripheral nervous system, cranial nerves and spinal nerves, and this is actually the communication line between the CNS and the rest of the body, and it's sending impulses and receiving impulses, and that's what it carries out with it. The peripheral has a sensory division and a motor division. You can see the sensory is somatic and visceral sensory fibers. They conduct impulses from the receptors to the central nervous system. So here we are going to define the word receptors. And then here the motor division, it conducts impulses from the CNS to effectors. And you can see the effectors is given as muscles and glands. So in other words, effectors are nothing else but the things which bring about the effect. And what brings about the effect? That jerking away your hand, it was a muscle. Or crying, it was a gland which secreted, okay? So effectors are the muscles and glands. And then the motor division, remember, had two parts to it. There was the somatic, where it was going to skeletal, and it was also known as voluntary. And autonomic, which was going to visceral muscle, which was cardiac or smooth. So it was involuntary. So you can see it conducts impulses to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Autonomic is further divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic. And then here, it's kind of showing you that the sensory are shown in blue and the motor is shown in red. So look at sensory fiber. See, somatic sensory going from the skin. Look at it going from an organ. This would be called visceral sensory. So these two, the skin and the organ, they react differently to sensation. Remember, organs react to either stretch or ischemia, whereas the skin reacts to all of those general sensations we talked about: touch, temperature, pain, pressure, all of that. And then motor impulses from the central nervous system, they go to skeletal muscle, so that is the somatic part. And when they go to cardiac or smooth muscle, then that is part of the autonomic. Okay, so this is a really, really good slide. Pay attention to this slide, and that will really kind of cement this beginning concepts. Let's look at these two words, receptors and effectors. Effector, as I said, is something which brings about an effect, which as shown here is muscles and glands. So effectors are what are called muscles and glands, either skeletal, cardiac or smooth, or glands. Like I said, salivary, lacrimal gland, the glands of your digestive tract. That's what are effectors. Receptors, what are receptors? Again, we did some of this. If you remember when we were doing the integumentary system, so I'm going to erase this. When we were doing the integumentary system and we looked at the epidermis, and I'm sure you all will remember, there was a cell called the Merkel's cell or Merkel's disc we talked about, and we said it was a touch receptor. And then we said in the dermis are other receptors which are present. For example, we have something known as free nerve endings, which are receptors for pain. So free nerve endings, which are pain receptors. We have other receptors such as Pacinian corpuscles. So there are many such receptors. I'm giving you just 3 examples. Merkel's disc, which you did free nerve endings, which are the ones which sense pain, and then Pacinian corpuscles are again little things present in the dermis, which again sense pressure, deep pressure or touch. So therefore, if I was to poke your hand or something, it would be the free nerve endings. The receptors are kind of little structures which are present in the skin or in the organs which are able to carry the sensation to the central nervous system. That's the beginning of where the sensation is going to start. Okay, so for example, if I was to touch your hand gently, it would be your Merkel's disc which might be stimulated, and it will carry the impulse to the central nervous system. If I was to poke it really hard so that you feel pain, it would be free nerve endings which would be stimulated, and they will begin the passage of impulse to the central nervous system. Okay, so that's what receptors are. They are the structures which feel the sensation and then propagate the impulse towards the central nervous system. Effectors are the end result, the one that brings about the reaction, like muscle or glands. Okay? So now let's begin. So since we've talked about all these various divisions, now we'll talk about cells in the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And before we talk about the cell, which actually is what is called the structural and functional unit, we'll talk about cells which are supporting cells. And these are actually a lot more than the actual cell which conducts impulses, because part of the nervous system was to conduct impulses, one of the main functions, right? So these cells support that conducting cell. So these are known as supporting cells, and they really outnumber what are known as the structural and functional units. So there are many types of supporting cells. The first one, whenever you have a cell, you must always know its function. So therefore, it's a really good idea to read, and this is kind of a quick guide for what are the functions. So the first cell is astrocyte. Astro comes from the word astral, which is like star-like, in the sky, astral body, like star-like. So you can see this is an astrocyte. If you look at an astrocyte, you can see it has numerous kind of things which look like tentacles, so it looks like a star. And what it does is, it attaches, you can see one part of this is attached to a blood vessel, and the other part of this astrocyte is attached to a neuron. And a neuron is what is called the functional unit. This is the functional unit of the nervous system. It is the cell which conducts impulses, the neuron. So this astrocyte is supporting the neuron. So what it does is, as you can see, one of its tentacles is attached to the capillary and another one is attached to the neuron. So what it does is, it steals nutrition from the capillary and passes it on to the neuron, because the neuron cannot directly take it from the capillary, so it steals this nutrition which passes from the capillary wall into its tentacle, and then it travels and it passes it on to the neuron. So it is important for conveying nutrition to the neuron. It also monitors the environment all around. So it makes sure that everything is kept healthy for the neuron to be able to act properly. So if things are in excess, it will make sure that it removes them and sends them out. It also is used, you remember we had something called acetylcholine esterase when we were talking about the neuromuscular junction, which removed that acetylcholine. Now, when we do nerves, we'll find same way neurotransmitters are released at the synaptic cleft, and after the neurotransmitters have done their job, these neurotransmitters are taken back into the neuron and they are recycled. So these astrocytes kind of help them to recycle them. Okay, they don't, unlike acetylcholine esterase which destroys it, these kind of help to take it back. And in fetal life, they also are very, very important because they help to make connections. The more connections you have between nerve cells, connections between nerve cells are known as synapses. So synapses are connections between nerve cells. So these are connections between nerve cells. So if this is one nerve cell and it meets another one, like this area is called a synapse. A synapse is very similar to a neuromuscular junction. Remember, only there you had a nerve and a muscle. In a synapse, here you'll have a nerve and a nerve, right? That's why it was called, even in a neuromuscular junction, you remember it was called a synaptic cleft, right? Everything else, we use synaptic vesicles. Yes?
I know that you said that in fetal development this happens, but can this also happen later on in life?
It can. The more
injuries and things.
it can. It helps. The more whenever we start learning something new, new connections are made. So, that's why throughout life they say you've got to kind of keep learning things so that you keep your brain growing. So yes, it helps later on too. But
if you lose loss of function or something.
In the brain, well, when you lose function in the central nervous system, there's no regeneration in the central nervous system. So it's not like you kind of things grow back there. But so that is not done by these astrocytes. So it's not like they'll bring back those synapses. But it can form new synapses when you learn something new. Okay? So these are some of the really important actions of the astrocytes. The second type of cell are known as oligodendrocytes, or also known as oligodendroglia, because these supporting cells are also known as glial cells. So supporting cells are also called glial cells because the reason they are called glial cells is because another term for them is like nerve glue. They are what keeps everything held together in the nervous system. So they're like a glue. So it's called nerve glue. So we can also call them astroglia instead of astrocytes. Oligodendrocytes can also be called oligodendroglia. And their function is to lay down myelin in the central nervous system. Myelin is a fatty protein coat present around nerve fibers. So around nerve fibers, this is a kind of like an insulating coat which is present. It's got fat, lipid and protein, lipoprotein is what it is. And it kind of makes that, you've seen like whenever you have a plug, you've seen how the plug has that black insulating material. So something like that. Think of myelin like that. So oligodendroglia or oligodendrocytes lay down myelin in the central nervous system. Since I specified they lay down myelin in the central nervous system, you should automatically start thinking that in the peripheral nervous system there must be some other cell which does that, okay? And that's important for you to know. And the way they do it is, you can see this is one oligodendrocyte. It's kind of myelinating. It's forming this myelin sheath around at least three nerve fibers are seen. So one oligodendrocyte can actually myelinate many nerve fibers.
Is that the myelin with the fat and milk helps put infants to insulate the nerve pulses so that the connections are being made?
The fat in milk?
Yeah.
No. Not that I know of. The fat in milk helps to lay down myelin, not that I know.
The fat from the milk, is that, because you said that the myelin has... It's lipoprotein, it's fat constituent, but I don't know whether the fat in milk specifically goes just for myelin. Fat in your body, which you absorb, is helpful for a lot of things. Myelin, cell membrane, steroidal hormones. So specifically just to go for myelin, I don't think so. I just was wondering that.
Yeah, okay. The other type of glial cell present in the central nervous system is known as microglia. So they're really small, and their function is phagocytosis. So whenever there is a brain injury, for example, the microglia will come to that site and they'll remove all the cell debris in that area. They take a while to come, which is why sometimes scar tissue forms in between, and that's why healing in the central nervous system, if there's damage in the central nervous system, it does not regenerate because, the cell debris take time to be removed. Scar tissue forms meanwhile inside, and plus you don't have certain factors which are responsible or needed for regeneration. Okay? So their function is phagocytic. And then we have another type of cell where inside the brain and the spinal cord. So when you look at the brain and spinal cord, and if I draw it here, so let me say I just look at the brain and I was able to cut a section of the brain, I actually will see there's a cavity inside the brain like this, okay? This cavity, we'll see later, this cavity has a name which is called ventricle. This cavity inside is lined by these cells which are known as ependymal cells.
And they have little cilia. You can see this. They have the ciliary processes up here. Not ciliary process, cilia. Ciliary process, something else actually. They help, by the beating of the cilia, they help to circulate something known as cerebrospinal fluid. CSF stands for cerebrospinal fluid, which is present in these cavities. And we will, when we do the brain, we will talk about this cerebrospinal fluid. They actually even help with some blood vessels. They actually even help to make the cerebrospinal fluid. So later we'll see that ependymal cells actually even help to make the cerebrospinal fluid, okay? So these are the functions of these glial cells in the central nervous system. So let's look at the cells, these glial cells in the peripheral nervous system. So here there are two types. One is called Schwann cells. They are the counterparts of oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes are only found in the central nervous system. That means they're only found in the brain and spinal cord. So in the brain and spinal cord, remember it's oligodendrocyte. But when you take these peripheral nervous system, which is cranial and spinal nerves, myelin is laid on these nerves too. So in the brain and spinal cord, when you have nerves traveling up or down, the myelin there is laid by the oligodendrocytes. But here on the peripheral nervous system, the myelin is laid by these Schwann cells. So that's why you must know which cell lays myelin where. And then we have another type of cell which are called satellite cells. In the peripheral nervous system, you can see they are surrounding the neuron, and they are very similar to astrocytes. Previously their function was not known. Now they believe that they are probably nutritive in function. They probably provide nutrition to the neuron in the peripheral nervous system, okay? So very important, make flashcards and know all these functions of these different cells. So, let's do a quick review. Myelin in the CNS is formed by oligodendrocytes, remember, and not astrocytes, not Schwann cells. Oligodendrocytes are the ones which form myelin in the central nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system is Schwann cells. The astrocytes do not form myelin at all. They are nutritive. They help to build synapses. They do all of those other things. Okay, here, think of this. Suppose this person, you get a question like this. So whenever you get these kind of a little bit like, a problem where you're given a problem, always look for keywords. So here the keyword is astrocytes. It resulted in the death of astrocytes. This would affect. In other words, this question is really asking you what is the function of astrocytes and what would be affected. Nutrition of the neurons. Yes, very good. Nutrition of the neurons. Myelin formation in the central nervous system is oligodendrocyte. Phagocytic function in the CNS is the microglia. Okay? So it is nutrition of the neurons. Myelin in the peripheral is Schwann cells. Now let's look at the cell which conducts the impulses. So we had looked at the supporting cells. They are the ones which just kind of support all this, and they are supporting this particular cell. So this is the structural unit of the nervous system. It's called the neuron. This is the only cell which can conduct impulses. So its function is to conduct impulses. Highly specialized. which is why it has a very, very long lifespan. Neurons can live for a really, really long time. So whenever anything gets very, very specialized, it is at the cost of not being able to divide. You know, for example, epithelium and connective tissue, they regenerate very fast. They're not so highly specialized. Muscle and nervous tissue are highly specialized because they have lots of different functions, but that's at the cost of not being able to regenerate. Just as muscle cells don't regenerate, similarly nerve cells don't divide. Okay, they don't they don't undergo mitosis. They have a very high demand for oxygen and glucose, which is why your brain cannot do without oxygen beyond a few minutes, right? So whenever someone's asphyxiating or something, you want to make sure you quickly get air in so that oxygen goes to the brain. So very high demand for oxygen and glucose. They use glucose for ATP production. Let's look at the parts of a neuron. This kind of a neuron which has been shown here is, we will see later, we'll be classifying them. This is what is called a multipolar neuron. As the name suggests, multi meaning many, polar meaning many poles. So this is a typical picture of a multipolar neuron. You can see this area here has, you can see lots of projections coming, many poles, okay? That's why it's called multipolar. Let's see the parts of the neuron. So the parts of the neuron is, it has a very large part which is known as the cell body, or also known as the soma. So this part here is called the cell body, or also called the soma. Like everything else, this is the place which has all the cell organelles, because it's so large. It has the Golgi apparatus, it has the nucleus, the nucleolus, the endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria, all that. So that's why it's called the biosynthetic center. So this is the cell body. Then it has numerous processes. I mean, the processes may be one or many. So it has these processes. The smaller of the processes are known as dendrites. So the dendrites are small. They can range from one to many. And they are the receptive regions. That means impulses from somewhere will come and they will synapse on a dendrite usually, and then the impulse from the dendrite will travel to the cell body and it will go along this way, okay? So they receive impulses, so therefore they are called receptive regions. So we can say that these are small processes, can be one to many, and they are the receptive regions. So that's one set of processes. Then a neuron has another long process, and that's a single process. So the single process is called an axon. So it's long, single. All neurons have one axon, can never be more than one. And these are impulse generating, and they generate and they conduct impulses away from the cell body. So you can see these are impulse generating and conducting regions. So this is where the impulse generates. It will travel down this axon, come to the end of the axon. At the end of the axon, there are swellings which are present, which are known as axon terminals. That's where the secretory region is, where the synaptic vesicles are. So if I was to draw that for you, so imagine if I just draw a neuron like this. These are the dendrites and this is an axon. So this axon comes down, and towards its end you will find that it has little swellings like this. These swellings are known as axon terminals. And if I take one terminal like this, and this is what you saw at the neuromuscular junction. Remember the axon terminal? Inside this is where you have those synaptic vesicles which contain the neurotransmitter. Okay? So at the end, the axon is swollen where it forms axon terminal. So that's why it's called secretory region, because it has synaptic vesicles. Where the axon begins, from the cell body, that area is over here, this part where the axon begins is known as the axon hillock. It kind of looks a little raised. So this is the axon hillock, okay? So the axon hillock is the region from where the axon, beyond which the axon will begin. And here you can see again in the cell, in the soma or the cell body, you can see a nucleus, very, very prominent nucleolus, lots of mitochondria. These little things are mitochondria. And in a neuron, you have rough endoplasmic reticulum. Remember, rough endoplasmic reticulum was a site where proteins were manufactured and transported. In a neuron, this rough endoplasmic reticulum is very, very prominent and takes a prominent stain. So this rough endoplasmic reticulum, this area here, forms, it looks very granular when you look at it under the microscope. So this is known as Nissel's granules. So Nissel's granules are nothing but rough endoplasmic reticulum, which you see in the cell body of a neuron, stained very darkly. And it's just another name for that. You know, just like in a muscle cell, remember we call terminal cisternae or the dilated part of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Here we give the endoplasmic reticulum another name. We call it Nissel's granules. Now here you can see that this is showing you, and since it says Schwann cell, obviously that means this is a nerve which is in the peripheral nervous system, and it has, this Schwann cell has laid down myelin like this. If it was the central nervous system also it would be the same, only the cell would be different. You can see the myelin is laid down, and the way the myelin is laid down, you can see it's kind of laid down in blocks. So in between these blocks there is an area of naked nerve fiber. Can you see that? Okay. And this space between one part of the myelin and the next part of the myelin, this little space here is known as the node of Ranvier. This where this gap is, it's called the node of Ranvier. So this area is called the node of Ranvier. Now in the nervous system, it is not necessary that all fibers are myelinated. Some fibers in the nervous system may not be myelinated. So you may have non-myelinated fibers. Usually thin fibers tend to be non-myelinated. Very thick nerves tend to be myelinated. Wherever there is myelin present, you will have this node of Ranvier. And impulses will jump from one node of Ranvier to the other because this myelin acts like a insulator. So it doesn't allow the impulse to pass through there. So from one naked area to the other, the impulse passes. So it jumps from one node to the other. This kind of a jumping type of impulse going from one node of Ranvier to the other is known as saltatory conduction. So saltatory conduction is where impulses jump. As the impulse travels down the axon, it'll go from one node to the other like this. It'll jump this way. If it was a non-myelinated fiber, so imagine if there was a neuron which was like this, had no myelin, the impulse will just travel all the way down like this. Okay? It'll go through the entire length of the fiber. So imagine this myelin is these nodes of Ranvier are something like these overpasses that you have, you know, when you have highways, like going from one overpass to the other. You may all have heard of a condition known as multiple sclerosis. I'm sure everybody in this classroom has heard of that, right? Multiple sclerosis is a condition which is known as a demyelinating disease, where the myelin is actually removed, and it happens in the central nervous system. The myelin is removed because the body reacts to it. So it's kind of what is called an autoimmune disease. So the phagocytic cells go and attack the myelin, and they kind of remove the myelin from here and from different areas, and it happens in the central nervous system, not in the peripheral nervous system. So with the result, the impulses are not able to travel properly. So that's why those people, if sensory fibers are involved, they cannot feel sensations properly. If motor fibers are involved, they cannot carry out actions properly. And it kind of can become progressive. Of course, a lot of research is being done, and they're finding different ways to kind of at least halt the disease, or decrease its progression. So let's look at some questions here. Having seen how impulses travel along myelinate, you had a question? Oh, sorry, yes.
With the multiple sclerosis, you know how some people, they can be like completely paralyzed, but be so smart in their head. How does that, since it's affecting the central nervous system, will that eventually too go or no?
So the question was, it's in the people with multiple sclerosis are usually so smart in their head, and but they otherwise, I think when you say paralyzed, I think you're also mixing it up with Lou Gehrig's disease. I think maybe that. In Lou Gehrig's disease, which affects just motor fibers, that's where they get paralyzed. They cannot move at all, but the intellect is completely, kept there. That's because it's only the motor fibers which are involved there, and the intellect still it keeps up there. In the case of here, even in multiple sclerosis, that nothing happens to the intellect. It still continues to be the way it is. And that's because in that, the transmission of impulses, when the demyelination occurs, it occurs in what are called tracks, which we'll do a little later, which are sensory and motor tracks. This communication and the processing or as judgment and so on, that doesn't get affected early in this disease. Okay? Yes.
You said that some neurons have no myelin sheath.
Yes.
That impulse goes straight through. But these neurons that do have the myelin sheath, what causes it? I mean, is either one better than the other, or what causes it to have that myelin sheath?
Okay, so question is, why do some have myelin and why don't some have myelin? Well, it just so happens thin nerve fibers, pain fibers, for example, are very thin fibers. They don't have a myelin sheath, which is just as good for us because that, and I'll tell you the answer actually, because I have a question coming and maybe that'll help you. So let's answer that question first and then we come back to it, okay? So here, where do you think impulse conduction would be faster? In non-myelinated or myelinated fibers? Ooh, okay, it's exactly the opposite. Impulses are faster in myelinated fibers because, look at this, they don't have to travel the entire length going this way. They are jumping, they're using overpasses. Remember I said they were like overpasses, like,
So
when you don't want...
for them to jump?
Pardon?
Is it normal for them to jump?
They have to jump. They can only go through where there is these gaps in the myelin. So they jump like this. So they go really fast. So impulses travel very fast in myelinated fibers, not so fast in non-myelinated because they have to go through the entire length of the whole nerve, the whole axon, okay? Now coming to your question, like why do some have myelin, why don't some have myelin? In the body, thin fibers tend not to have myelin, and pain fibers are one really good example, which is just as good for us because it takes long for the pain to actually reach your brain and for you to perceive it. Other motor fibers are very thick. You want a reaction really fast, so those are myelinated. So where the body needs a quick reaction, you will find fibers are myelinated. Where the reaction does not need, or the processing does not need to be so quick, then they are unmyelinated. Okay? Yes.
Do these use ATP? Do they have an energy source?
Yes, the mitochondria up here. The cell, yes, the cell will have the ATP. Okay. So now having described, now this is again a very important concept. So you have to understand this because we are going to be talking of, I'm going to be using these terms over and over again. Okay, so pay particular attention. So we talked about nerve cell body, like the soma, okay, and then we talked about processes, the dendrites and axons. So dendrites are usually, they are attached to the nerve cell and they're very short, right? Whereas the axon is something that's really long. So it can travel very far away from the nerve cell body. So in the brain and in nervous system, we kind of use certain terms wherever we see a collection of nerve cell bodies and wherever we see a collection of axons, okay? So just to give you an example, so we don't have, here it's only showing you for only one sort of fiber or one axon, but look at it this way. So imagine if I draw, I was drawing a nerve like this, right? Okay, so that takes too long. So I'm going to draw, this is the soma and this is the axon, and we'll pretend that the dendrites are all here like that, okay? So here, look at this way. So this is where this is how the nerve cells begin and they travel down. So can you see they'll travel all the way down like this. Here also they begin this way and then they come here. So wherever you see this, they come down like this. And in the spinal cord also, here I'm drawing, okay? So can you see that I said this was the cell body and this was the axon. So wherever we have this collection of nerve cell bodies, this here, or as I showed here, or here. Can you understand? Wherever nerve cells are beginning, where the cell body is lying, we use different terms for it. We use the term gray matter, okay? And you can see the gray matter is up here in the periphery of the brain, and in the spinal cord it's in the center. We can also use the word cortex. So we can use cortex, we can use gray matter. We can also use the word nucleus. Nucleus means just little islands of gray matter. Okay, so here you can see these are islands of gray matter. And just to give you a little history so that it becomes clear to you, when the nervous system was developing, so don't draw, just listen to me. So when the primitive nervous system was developing, the nerve cells were in the center. And then they sent out their axons like this towards the periphery. Okay, so this was a very, very simple nervous system which was developing. And then life evolved, and there was only so much surface area, so only so many sort of neurons you could have. As life evolved and, say the human being developed, we found that now the brain became, instead of being something just simple like this, it became a highly convoluted structure this way, okay? And here was the spinal cord. So from this central area, some of these nerve cell bodies, they decided that they are going to migrate to the periphery. So if you migrate here so that you begin from the periphery, can you see that you have a greater surface area? You'll have more neurons, right? So this now in the brain, you can see that this gray matter is now present on the outside, whereas in the spinal cord, can you see it is present in the center, okay? Some of this gray matter got left behind in the center of the brain. And where it got left behind, you find these little islands. Okay? So therefore, in the brain, you have gray matter or nerve cell bodies in the periphery, and you also have a little bit in the core, whereas in the spinal cord, you can see you have gray matter in the center. What is gray matter? Where these nerve cell bodies begin, like this, where these nerve cell bodies begin. So any collection of nerve cell bodies is called gray matter. It can also be known as cortex. For example, if this was part of the cerebrum, I would say cerebral cortex. If it was part of something called the cerebellum, I would say cerebellar cortex. It can also be called nucleus. The word nucleus also means this. So there's a nucleus called caudate nucleus or lentiform nucleus. Just tells you that it's an area of gray matter which has nerve cell bodies. Okay? Wherever we have this collection of axons here, these group, because axons don't travel singly, they all travel together, right? Okay. So these axons, the collection of axons is known as white matter. So you can see in the brain, the axons are, the white matter is present in the center. In the spinal cord, the white matter is present towards the periphery. Collection of axons may also be called tracks. So here they've only shown one axon. So if I draw all together, so these are tracks. Or they may also be called a nerve. Okay, when I say nerve, remember we said a muscle needs a nerve to supply it. So when I say nerve, what I mean is there are lots of axons in that nerve. Okay, got that? So these are terms that we use in relation to these parts of the neuron, okay? So wherever there's a collection of this nerve cell bodies, many of these together, we will call it gray matter, cortex or nucleus. Whenever there's collection of many of these lying together, we call it tract, nerve or white matter, okay? So if I was to ask you this question, the red nucleus in the brain will contain a preponderance of, meaning more of what? Nerve cell bodies, axons, astrocytes, or oligodendrocytes? Nerve cell bodies. Remember, we were just talking about these two. We were not mentioning these two at all. So here, when we were talking up here, that's why looking at these slides is so important. See, collection of neuron cell bodies is either gray matter, nucleus, or ganglia. Neuron is the important thing. So that's why we collection of processes or collection of nerve cell bodies. So we call them these three. Or collection of axons is white matter, tracts, or nerve. Nothing to do with astrocytes or oligodendrocytes, okay?
What's the purpose of the red?
Yeah.
What's that?
What's the purpose of the red?
Okay, the red. Red doesn't matter. Okay, that cell that you saw on that slide, it was just colored red. You know, when you looked at an astrocyte, it doesn't mean astrocytes are red in your brain. The red, that's why the word nucleus was highlighted, because that's what I wanted you to pay attention to. It doesn't matter, I can call it blue or green or whatever. There is a nucleus in your brain called the red nucleus, because that nucleus has a pigment and it makes it look a little red, so that's why it's called red nucleus, okay? So there is really a nucleus there. So red was unimportant. It was here. And remember, those pictures that you see, the colors used in those pictures are just to, kind of differentiate them. So if you were to open your brain, you're not going to, and look under a microscope, you're not going to see astrocytes as being red in color, okay?
What's the name of this?
That's the myelin. That's the nerve fiber. Yeah.
The nerve fiber.
It's the nerve fiber or myelin?
With the it's the nerve fiber.